I think we can get started now. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're meeting on the traditional lands of the Pambalong clan of the Awabakal people and paying my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Tonight's lecture is by Laureate Professor Jenny Gore, who has been at the University of Newcastle since 1991. She began her career as a teacher in South Australia and then did a master's in education at, UBC, yes, University of British Columbia, and then a PhD in Wisconsin. She's been at the University of Newcastle since 1991 and been extremely successful, I have to say. She's had she leads currently the Teachers and Teaching Research Centre and has won several awards, including the Australian Council of Deans Award for Outstanding Contributions to Education Reform in 2017 and the Paul Brooke Memorial Medal. She's also been visiting professor at the University of Oxford and has had something like $23 million in grants since 1992. She's also had 103 journal publications and a book and 39 book chapters and numerous other publications that have received a very large number of citations, and she's also had impact through substantial consultations with government education systems. And also, finally, she was elected a Fellow of the American Education Research Association in 2020. So she's here tonight to tell us about some of the things she has learned and implemented, I think, in education reform. So thank you, Jenny.
Yeah, thanks very much, George. And thank you for coming out on a rainy night. It's lovely to see a few of you here at least, and I guess there will be more people who watch this subsequently on the video. I come from a line of teachers, so my mother was a kindergarten teacher her entire working life. But my aunt, my grandmother, a couple of great-grandfathers were all teachers. So teaching has been a kind of a lifelong passion for me. And I think this work that I'm doing and talking about now really stems from trying to do better for teachers and for students. And it's one of those journeys in life that you never arrive at the destination because there's always, new students, new policies, new social conditions that kind of impact on what schooling looks like. So we know right now that schooling is quite troubled in a whole lot of ways, and that there is a lot of talk about what's happening for young people, what's happening in terms of equity. We're very worried about teacher shortages. There's just a whole lot of, if you like, angst at the same time as there's a lot of very positive stuff happening in schools. So I don't want to downplay the positives. I think it's very easy, and we see the media doing this, talking up the problems and not acknowledging or celebrating, the wonderful things that are also happening. But that's just a little bit of background. I guess what I'm going to be talking to you about is the research work that I've been doing here at the University of Newcastle for probably more than 20 years. And I first proposed this title with a question mark, An Elegant Solution to Enduring Problems in Education, because this is much more arrogant, if you like, than I would normally state. I would raise the question mark and show my humility and recognise that it's very hard to come up with things that we know in education are going to be good for everyone. A colleague and I actually presented a version of this talk in Denver in April this year, and Linda Darling-Hammond, who if anyone works in education, you would know that name. She's sort of one of the leading scholars in education in the US. She was actually advisor to President Obama during his presidential campaign, so a very highly regarded person. And we asked her to be the discussant at our session, And the first thing she said is, I think you can ditch the question mark. So she was persuaded. So that's why there is no question mark. But I guess I'm posing it as a question and very interested in any comments or questions you might have about what I've got to say. I mean, to call anything elegant, and I'm going to spend a bit of time just unpacking terms, what does it mean to sort of claim that we've come up with an elegant solution? And I guess as this slide says, you know, pleasingly ingenious and simple, because, you know, making something that's clever and satisfying. And it is a kind of a big claim, but in education there's so much that's complex and complicated. So how do we take all of that complexity and try and create something that's actually relatively easy to do, relatively easy to learn, relatively cost effective and so on. And I will now, I guess, try and persuade you that what we have created is something that at least meets some of these qualities. So I've really broken the talk into two parts. The first, very briefly, is to just talk a bit about the challenges that we're facing as a nation. And then really talking about how our work, which we call quality teaching rounds, and I'm going to explain that in a moment, how it's making a difference for teachers and for students and for schools and for society. And then in part two, if I've made this persuasive argument, the next question is, well, why isn't this happening in more places? Why isn't this happening in every school? And I want to talk there about how we collectively can make the case for more of quality teaching rounds. So to talk about the challenges, I mean, these are very familiar to most people. We need to lift student achievement, we need to produce more equitable outcomes, and we need to support teachers better. And just to touch on each of those briefly, student achievement, we hear a lot, especially with the most recent announcement of NAPLAN results, we hear a lot that students' performance is declining, that literacy and numeracy levels are going down, and certainly that's the media reporting. I just actually, before coming here, attended a webinar by a senior lecturer at UNE. Her name's Sally Larson. She's a fabulous young academic. She's done an analysis of the last 20 years of NAPLAN, but also PISA, PIRLS and TIMS, which are the kind of main international data that are used to compare how students are going, and has found that not only is there no decline in NAPLAN achievement, there's actually improvement, especially for Year 3 and Year 5 students. Year 7 and Year 9 students, it's pretty stagnant. Nonetheless, we're not doing so well on PISA, and OECD nations overall are not doing quite as well on PISA as we once did. And some of the explanations given for that include the impact of social media on young people's lives. And as I said to a colleague earlier this evening, I'm so glad I grew up without a mobile phone and without the kinds of pressures that young people feel these days. You know, it used to be if you had a hard time at school, you would go home and you'd forget about it, or at least worry just about that overnight, as opposed to the relentless kind of barrage of sometimes bullying that occurs through social media overnight. So student achievement is something we still as a nation want to do better at, and not only for national comparisons and international comparisons, which the government cares about a lot, but for the sake of young people, for the sake of university education, for the sake of every other discipline. What teachers do and how students perform shapes everything else. So it's such an important role that we play. In terms of equity, in Australia we have invested a lot in trying to produce more equitable outcomes. The national goals for the education of young people, which have been agreed to by national and state ministers for education, talk consistently about excellence and equity. But we're not delivering on equity. In fact, we're one of the most unequal nations when you compare top performances of students with bottom performances of students. And that's partly because of the system that developed here when education was set up in this colony. We had church schools, we had a really strong division that has meant we have independent schools, Catholic schools and public schools or government schools, with divisions between them that are larger than in most other nations. So there's a kind of structural problem there for the whole nation in terms of how our schooling system's set up. But then we have other kinds of problems. Michelle Bruniges, who used to be Secretary of Education federally, recently was commissioned to look at the questions of disadvantage in Australian schools. And she found that the concentrations of disadvantage in particular schools are getting worse, not better. So we have schools that are really quite divided, and that's been a concern with the development of selective schools. We have the cream of the crop, if you like, taken into those schools and separated from the concept of a more comprehensive high school. Indigenous outcomes has been something that many people have been concerned with for a long time, and yet we still see vast differences for our students who are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander compared to those who are non-Indigenous. We see vast differences in terms of location, and we see vast differences in terms of socio-economic status. And of course, those three categories I just named are often intersecting. So we have, and we know we have, more low SES, low socioeconomic status people living in rural locations. The proportion of Indigenous students in some rural locations is greater. So you have all of those intersecting forms of disadvantage. The government keeps pushing, for example, for greater parity of participation in higher education. We should have proportionally as many young people from rural areas attending university as we do in metropolitan areas. But in rural areas, there's greater disadvantage, there's greater challenges that mean parity of participation is unlikely ever to be achieved. And is that necessarily a bad thing? Some of the students we've talked with in rural areas have said, why would I go to university when I can earn a perfectly good living out here, farming, working in the wine industry, the mining industry, and so on. So, it's all complicated, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges we face in education is simply the complexity and the intersection of schooling with everything else that's going on in society. The housing crisis, the cost of living, these are putting enormous pressures on all of us, parents, families, children, teachers, government, and so on. And the question of supporting teachers, I don't think in all my years involved in education, and as George said, I did my master's in 1983. I guess I graduated from university in 1980, and that's when I began teaching. I have never seen education be as challenged as I think it is right now, and I think teachers are really bearing the brunt of a lot of the kinds of things that I've been talking about. With the teacher shortages that we're experiencing now, the pressures on teachers are greater than ever. We're seeing attrition from teaching that's at unprecedented levels, and teachers who are really unhappy because of the pressures. We've got teacher education students who are being accredited to teach in their third year of a 4-year degree. They're going into schools where teachers are under enormous pressure because there's not enough teachers, so those teachers can't look after them properly or supervise or mentor them properly, and yet they're starting their degrees in their teaching careers in these kinds of situations. So we need better support for teachers. We have huge numbers of teachers who are teaching out of field. That means they're teaching maths even though they were trained in physical education, because we don't have enough maths and science teachers and STEM teachers in general. So there's a lot of challenges out there, and it actually can be quite depressing, and I chuckle because I try to maintain hope. But I think hope comes not from dreaming of a better future. Hope comes from finding paths of action we can actually take and evidence that those actions will make a difference. And that's, I guess, what we've been working on over all of this time is, how can we actually help teachers to deliver excellence and equity and make schools, I guess, more engaging places for students. In 2003, with a colleague here at the University of Newcastle, we developed what's called the quality teaching model. And this has now been used in many different places, but it's not something we just dreamt up. It's based on all of the research on effective teaching. And it says if we want student achievement to be strong, we need to ensure there's intellectual quality. There's challenge, there's depth, that students walk away not just having gone through the lessons, gone through the curriculum, but they actually understand things. That there is a quality learning environment. In a lot of schools, particularly where there's a lot of disadvantage, there can be a real focus on student welfare and looking after kids and making sure they're safe and happy. And that's really important, especially in some of those really disadvantaged contexts. But if we just keep kids safe and happy, we're not doing our job as educators, which is to ensure student learning. So we're looking at trying to ensure that every lesson is focused on student learning in environments that are supportive and so on. And then we want to make learning significant. And by significant, I mean you can use relevant if you prefer, but it's how we connect what students are learning in school to their own lives and to the wider world, so they can see the point of being there. It kind of addresses that question, when am I ever going to use this, sir, that I remember asking myself, in year 8 maths. And so it's about how we can keep those 3 principles in mind. When people talk about pedagogy or teaching, they often talk about the skills of a teacher, asking good questions, giving good feedback, being good at organising things. But teaching is more than that. And I like to think of this as about the practice of teaching in the same way that we might think about the practice of law or the practice of medicine. These are the big principles. It's not all the detail of how you do the job. It's what are we trying to achieve here? We want intellectual rigour, challenge, depth. We want kids to learn, and we want to make that learning meaningful. Because if it's meaningful, they're more likely to be engaged, and therefore teachers' jobs will be easier, and so on. So this model was developed in 2003, and we've done a lot of research into the model since. One of the things we concluded is that the model itself is not enough. You've got to have a powerful way of working with it. Just before I go on to that, for each one of these elements, and I don't think I put it in this presentation, I didn't, we have 6 elements. So under intellectual quality, for example, we talk about deep knowledge, deep understanding, higher order thinking, substantive communication. And for each of those elements, we have a 5-point coding scale that teachers themselves can use. So they can go into a lesson, and if there was no higher order thinking, it was all lower order rote recall stuff, it would code a 1. There was no higher order thinking in this lesson. If there was one major question involving higher order thinking, they would code it a 3. If most students, most of the time in the lesson, were involved in higher order thinking, they'd code it a 5. And that kind of fine-grained, and the 2s and 4s I just skipped over, but that fine-grained specification of good quality teaching is a way of really helping teachers to deliver practice in a way that produces better outcomes for kids. And we've got evidence of that, which I'll show you in a minute. We're actually using this model now in higher education as well. So not only for school teachers, but for university academics across all fields of study, because a lot of people who teach in universities have never learned about teaching. What they know is through what we call the apprenticeship of observation. Everyone spent 12 years at school and X years at university, and we tend to teach how we were taught. So we're also elaborating this for a university context, and we've now got people in other universities in Australia who are trialling this approach as well, but I'm not going to be talking much about the university work. But just having a model is never enough. You just have, yet another framework, yet another document that people often end up filing in the metal circular bin, effectively. So we wanted to find a way that we could work with the model that would be really powerful. And this is where we looked into all the literature on effective professional learning. And we came up with this approach that we call quality teaching rounds. It partly draws on the notion of medical rounds, or ward rounds, where young doctors would walk around, perhaps with a mentor. We don't have a mentor, I'll come back to that in a moment, but they'd walk around and they'd look at, they'd talk about a particular case, they'd do some diagnostic work together and try and come up with good solutions. In a way, we've taken that idea and applied it to education. We have groups of 3 or 4 teachers together. So quality teaching rounds always involve more than 2 people. And they can be any people. So it can be a first year out teacher with a principal and someone at the midpoint of their career. It could be 2 teachers from kindergarten with a year 6 teacher and even with a year 12 teacher in a K to 12 kind of school. So you don't have to have specialist knowledge to be able to go into a classroom and look at the pedagogy. The focus is on the pedagogy as defined by the quality teaching model. The group comes together and we have them discuss something, a reading, which can be a YouTube clip or a TED talk or a policy document or a news item. But this is a way of building the social bonds among the 4 people. Because despite the fact that teachers work in schools with each other, they often rarely have the chance to talk about educational ideas together. So just having read something and coming together to talk about it for 30, 40 minutes, maybe an hour, is such a luxury for teachers. And we've talked at times, because this process can be a little bit time consuming, about could we drop the reading? But maybe we don't do that part of it. But the teachers love it, and they also, I think, find it really powerful for building those connections. They then go and watch one member of the group teach a lesson. And they always watch a whole lesson. There's a lot of activity in schools now where people do what they call walkthroughs. They walk through a class, they might hang out there for 5 or 10 minutes, and then that's the end of it. But when you watch 5 or 10 minutes of a lesson, you don't see the learning that's going on. You see something about the rapport the teacher has and the vibe of the classroom, if you like. We watch whole lessons because we believe it's more respectful of the teaching learning process and it's more respectful of teachers. And certainly I've been a teacher and I've had someone come into my room and you think, I wish you came in 5 minutes earlier when everything was humming and you've just come in at this flat spot. So, whole lesson. Everyone then codes the lesson on the 1 to 5 scale for the 18 elements, including the teacher who taught the lesson. So this is not us giving feedback on your practice, it's us using the chance to be in each other's classrooms to talk about our practice. So the teacher who coded the lesson codes themselves. Now, of course, they have a different perspective. They've been up the front there. They don't necessarily see what other people will see. But that's actually the basis for the last part of this, which is really sustained conversations. And so the teachers basically take turns, a group of 4. George might be the first person to speak. He will say, I coded deep knowledge of 4 because I saw these things happening. And the next person would say, well, I coded it a 2 because even though I agree with you, George, there was so much covered in this lesson, I don't think anything was done in depth. And the next person might say, well, I coded it a 5 because I thought there was a sustained focus on these key concepts. Once everyone has spoken, then the group tries to come to consensus about what was the best code on the 1 to 5 scale for that element in that lesson. And in the end, the numbers don't matter. The numbers also stay confidential to the group because we know that as soon as you start using numbers with teachers, they can feel very vulnerable. And in the past, people have wanted to use those for merit pay and other things. So the numbers stay with the group. But the numbers allow that kind of fine-grained analysis. And in the end, it doesn't even really matter if they agree or not, but they provide a basis for having these really powerful, rich conversations. So that's quality teaching rounds. Now, what distinguishes it from other things? We just run a 2-day workshop for at least 2 teachers per school to come and learn about the model and about rounds and to have a sort of simulated go at doing it. And that sets those 2 people up to run it for their colleagues. There's no additional external input. So a lot of professional development has external providers who regularly come to the school or whatever, but this is very much teacher-driven. The focus is on the quality of pedagogy. There's a lot of talk right now in Australian schools about the kind of pedagogy, explicit instruction, phonics, inquiry-based learning. There's this almost battle between about how we teach. We don't care what approach you use. You can do it well or you can do it poorly. And this framework gives teachers a basis for thinking about and focusing on the quality. It's also a really comprehensive account of pedagogy. It deals with how knowledge is treated, how students are treated, how students treat one another. It deals with behaviour management. It deals with equity issues. So it's really a wide account of teaching. The readings, as I said, build community. A lot of other PD approaches don't have this. The teachers always watch entire lessons. The fine-grained coding allows that specificity that often isn't available. It's all about teacher development, not assessment, and we make that really clear. In fact, in the resources it says this is not to be used for purposes of a teacher assessment. So if any principal ever tries to do that, they've got something they can put in front of them and say, you can't do that. It's all about reciprocity and turn-taking. Everybody takes a turn to teach, and we always say if you're in a group of 4, the most senior person, I don't mean necessarily in years, but in terms of positional authority, they should go first, make themselves vulnerable, borrow a class if they need to and teach, and show that this process can actually be really valuable. They do one set of 4 rounds, each teacher hosting a lesson observation, and that's it. And teachers tell us they can't go back. They can't not think about the elements of the QT model. Just by focusing on this kind of simple framework for how we understand good teaching, they can't go back. And I think one of my favourite quotes from all the interviews we've done with teachers was a deputy principal, about 40, been teaching 20 years. He said, "This is the first time in my career I feel I'm actually teaching students. Until now, I've just been giving them work to do." And it's quite a poignant statement. I've just been giving kids work to do and now I feel I'm teaching. And that's just really inspiring. We also, one of my others is a teacher who was put in a group to do this. She was voluntold to participate, and she didn't like the people she was put with. She said, I didn't like them and they didn't like me and we didn't know each other, she says, from a bar of soap. But when I was in the room with them and working with them, I learned to respect them and I learned who they really were. So what we're finding is this has powerful impact on how teachers understand good teaching and really powerful impact on their relationships with colleagues across a school. Especially in secondary schools, they're often separated by subject silos, if you like, but this brings people together across those boundaries. We also, even before COVID, developed a mode of doing all of this online. So instead of 4 teachers in a single school, we could bring together 4 teachers from 4 separate rural schools to work with one another online. And we get net promoter scores that are in the 70s, which means between excellent and world class. So really positive, I guess, endorsement. We wanted to cater for teachers in small, rural and remote schools who often miss out on professional development, or it's so expensive or so prohibitive in terms of, you know, time away from the class or time away from the family that they can't get to it. We've done a bunch of studies. Now, we've done randomised controlled trials, which are really quite rare in education in Australia. I think most people probably understand what they are, but they allow you to make causal claims. You've got a group and a matched control group. And so we did our first trial actually in 2014 and 2015, looking at the impact on teachers, and we saw really significant effects. In 2018, we actually won a $17 million grant from the Paul Ramsay Foundation to do this whole program of research. And so in 2019, we did our first big randomised controlled trial, and we saw significant effects on student achievement. I'll come back to that in a moment. We didn't get as many schools as we wanted in the first year. We wanted 200 schools. We only got 125, so we went again in 2020 and found 80 additional schools to bring the total to 200. COVID happened, and so we collected baseline data, and we couldn't collect end-of-year data, except that we did. They just couldn't do the intervention in the interim, but we were able to produce some of the world's first evidence of the impact of COVID on student learning, which interestingly in Australia was negligible. And in fact, we saw some disadvantaged groups catching up a little bit, and that's another whole ball game. People have said, well, does that mean we don't need schools then? Which is again another challenge. But we also, at the same time, did a trial of the digital approach of quality teaching rounds with 128 country schools. We did a trial in Queensland that was independently evaluated, so rather than us as the developers doing the evaluation, we had people from the Institute of Social Science Research at the University of Queensland do the evaluation. We tried to do a study, and that also took 2 years because they only got 58 schools. We decided we only needed 100, but we got 42 in the second year. And we tried to do a trial in Victoria post-COVID, which was actually very difficult. We also had opt-out consent, which is an ethics thing early on with the New South Wales work. In Victoria, we had to get every child and every parent of every child to sign a consent form. And it just meant the numbers of parents and student consents and the number of schools, therefore, was just inadequate for ever producing a significant result. At the same time, we did these implementation studies. So we did longitudinal research following 500 schools across the 5 years of the study. We did case studies in 12 schools around the country, and we also then started working with schools. We focused first of all on 10 Hunter schools and then on 20 schools across the state of New South Wales. When we got that grant, one of my colleagues said, we're going to be doing 20 years worth of research in 5 years. And absolutely, that's how it felt. If in Australia, in education, you're lucky to win an ARC grant every 3 years and get maybe $350,000 for a 3-year project. That enables you to hire one project manager or a research assistant. We had $17 million. They wanted us to do this program of research, to take the initiative to scale across the country, and to set up a business model to ensure that it didn't fall over when their funding ended. So it was a huge learning curve for all of us involved, and we had basically 4 academic staff do all of this. So I don't run a huge research centre. We have about 30 staff, but only 4 of us are academics. We've had a couple of postdocs. They're really hard to get in education, unlike in other fields. We've had a bunch of PhD students, but when I say that, probably only 6 have finished so far, and a lot of professional staff. And this is a team effort. In terms of lifting a student achievement, so what this shows on a dashboard is the control group. A normal year's achievement is an effect size of around 0.4, 0.5. That's just from being at school for a year. We have some people in education who are doing studies and reporting effects of 0.4 as if that's something grand when you just follow one group from start to end. But that's just the normal kind of growth that happens. For the group that did quality teaching rounds, the effect was around 0.6, and that's equivalent to 2 months of additional growth. Baseline data was collected in term 1, towards the end of term 1. Follow-up data was collected early in term 4. Teachers did 2 teachers came to a workshop. They did 1 set of rounds early in term 2, and this data was then collected in term 4. So that's the kind of rough design. Really fantastic to see that kind of achievement. There's all these nuances I just can't talk about. More recently, we've done a study with Cessnock High School. They learned about this work and said, we've got a little bit of money, can we partner with you to really try and lift this school? At the time, Cessnock was in pretty dire straits as a school, Cessnock High. We have colleagues who went out there to collect data and they were scared. They said walking across the schoolyard, it just felt like a very uncomfortable place. New principal, they started behind the state in that 2019 spot in terms of their average NAPLAN results from year 7 to year 9, the value add. And over the 3 years, they're now sitting above the state average. This is a school that has 75% of its students in the lowest quartile for socio-economic advantage, and 25% of its students are Indigenous. So to get that kind of turnaround in this school is amazing. And quality teaching rounds was at the core of the difference that they made. It wasn't the only thing. Great leadership, new principal who went in and said, I have high expectations of the students and the teachers in this school. They also got a little bit into trauma-informed pedagogy to try and address some of the needs of the students. And they worked with their middle leadership team, their deputies and head teachers, to make sure that they could drive the initiative. In terms of HSC performance, this is actually green, but it looks blue up here. The average school mark is the first bar in each set of groups. The statistically similar schools are in black and the state average is in red. You see this is HSC final year results. You see at the start they were well below the state average, and at the end of this study they're actually now very close to the state average, with a student population that is typically well behind the state average. So it just shows the kind of difference that it can make at a whole school level. And our staff who now go into that school say it's a whole different experience. Kids come up and say, hey miss, what are you doing here? And they feel comfortable. The school attendance has increased at triple the state average. The whole energy, I think, around not just this high school, but the primary schools and the community is so much more positive. So I guess what I'm trying to demonstrate there is we're having significant impact on student achievement. The Sydney Morning Herald earlier this year published a report on the top 24 schools in terms of HSC results and improvement. 21 of those had done quality teaching rounds with us, and 10 of them had quality teaching rounds written into their school plans. So just some bits and pieces of evidence there. In terms of equity, what we've found is in our randomised controlled trials, schools in the bottom ICSIA, so those less than 1,000, ICSIA is Index of Community and Socio-Educational Advantage. It's kind of the measure that's used for all Australian schools to kind of separate the wealthier, if you like, from the poorer schools. So at the top we have the wealthier schools, the bottom we have the poorer schools. And what you see is that for the control group and for the group that did quality teaching rounds, the growth between the start and the end of the randomised control trials was actually greater in the poorer schools. And that's not uncommon because they have further to move in a way. But the difference between the two bars is greater at the bottom as well. So it signals that this is narrowing the equity gap, which is what we've been trying to achieve. I guess I've already told the story of Cessnock, which I probably meant to leave till later, but that's Peter Riley, the principal there, and some of his colleagues, and my colleague Drew in the blue shirt, who led the initiative at the school. Peter has now moved to Jesmond High School, so heading up the kind of Callaghan College initiative. In terms of equity, one of the other projects that we've just started with a small grant from the Woodend Foundation is to think about how we use this approach to improve outcomes for Indigenous students. This is the reimagining evaluation framework that one of our colleagues, Nathan Towney, who many of you will have heard of, developed for the New South Wales Department of Education. But it's how do we take the quality teaching model and apply it, given everything we know about Indigenous students and communities and families and education. So what we're doing at the moment is linking these two things. We have an element called background knowledge. And while it's about teachers making sure they're drawing on students' knowledge from prior lessons, but also their out-of-school knowledge, we're asking teachers to think about what mob do these Indigenous students in my class, who do they identify with? Who else are they related to in the school? So it's a deeper understanding of the background knowledge rather than just saying learn about it. We have an element we call cultural knowledge, which is about bringing in non-dominant forms of knowledge into the lessons where it will enrich student learning. And we can say, make sure you're attentive to Indigenous knowledge. But in this case, we'd say, well, who are the elders? What is the cultural knowledge of this particular school community? Who are the Indigenous, or what are the Indigenous organisations with which this school is associated or could be? So it's actually just trying to enrich the quality teaching framework with what we know about good cultural interaction. So that's just another exciting piece of work that's ongoing for us. In terms of supporting teachers, I'm sorry this is so small and you're sitting so far away, but what we are doing is providing quality teaching rounds as part of a national initiative. The federal government gave us $5 million to work with 1,600 mainly early career teachers. And what we're finding is burnout, from before and after they do rounds, burnout's going down, shared vision, trust and respect and well-being are going up. And along the bottom, they're all measures of efficacy, so how teachers feel positive about the difference they're making, overall effective practice, classroom management, instructional strategies, and student engagement. Interestingly, in that project, we have each group of professional learning community involves 2 early career teachers and at least 1 teacher with more experience. And when we separate out the 2 groups, what we find is very similar results, particularly in the efficacy measures. The more experienced teachers in blue start higher, but the increase for them of doing quality teaching rounds is almost the same. And what we find really interestingly to me is a lot of experienced teachers tell us they feel more confident once they've done quality teaching rounds. And I mean, I think experienced teachers are confident. They've been doing it for a long time. But what a lot of people say to us is, I didn't know how good I was. And when you think about it, a lot of teachers don't get meaningful feedback on their practice. You know, occasionally a parent thanks you for what you did with their child, and occasionally a child says that was a great lesson, miss, but more often than not, you really don't know how good you are. And what the quality teaching model does is help teachers to get a sense of how good they are against those measures. So that's just really exciting. I will say also that it's having an impact on retention. So we've asked teachers about their intention to leave, and we're seeing a significant reduction in those who say they are intending to leave once they've done quality teaching rounds. And here's just an example from one of our schools. The group has been doing this, and they said after doing rounds, at one point we said, you know what, we're amazing. Like what we do in a day, people don't understand. All the decisions you have to make, all the energy, how much of yourself you have to put out. That energy day after day after day, you know. I can honestly say we walked away going, you know what, we're actually amazing. And I think that's just another lovely part of this, because teachers don't get to see one another working either. It's a relational activity, teaching. You've got people around you all the time, but you rarely get to actually see a colleague teach, and especially not a whole lesson. So this sense of efficacy that they feel about themselves is shared with their colleagues. They get to see people who they kind of knew they had a good reputation, but now they go, wow, you actually are an awesome teacher, and that's so nice. So there's all those sort of positive things that happen as well. This just gives you a sense, a map of Australia, of the growth over time. So you can see every dot here is a school that's engaged in the process, and with the New South Wales, we've had really strong impact. Also into Victoria and Queensland when we did those studies. This is just repeating that timeline. But with the national project we have going on right now and growing interest as people learn more about this, we've got people now in every state and territory that are engaging in the model. How am I going for time? I need to stop talking. So, given all of that, why isn't that happening everywhere? You would think that with all the evidence that we have of significant impact on teachers, students, schools, etc., that this would make a lot of sense. And there's 4 things I guess I want to talk about. I might leave out the last one. One is how it aligns with other frameworks. You know, in education there are so many different frameworks out there, one of which is the Australian Professional Standards for Teachers. And what we have to do often is to demonstrate the alignment. So you won't be able to see it from here, but what I've outlined there, which I can't see myself, hang on a sec, I need to put my glasses on, says students plan, structure and sequence learning with effective teaching strategies. I mean, what are effective teaching strategies? It's not specified. And so we can say, well, this can help teachers to produce effective teaching strategies because we've got more detail around that. So it's just one of the challenges. The other thing is we live in a very competitive professional development market. And these are just some of the kinds of arguments that are made about, you know, what's needed. And once upon a time, professional development was managed by governments who were delivering to teachers, but we've had this proliferation of external providers, many of whom do not have strong evidence for what they are subjecting teachers to. But we have to differentiate ourselves. We have to keep highlighting the evidence base that exists. And on that, interestingly, people in Sweden have heard about our work. They've just finished their first funded research project and another one starting. This week I've met with people in Wales and Germany. The Germans are starting a project in October. We have a PhD student who finished her thesis in Albania, post-communist country where the pedagogy is appalling. But the teachers there loved it. We've had a PhD student at another institution who worked in Indonesia, in some of the outer islands, and the teachers there loved it. We've got a colleague who's just collected his data in Japan, where there's a long history of what they call lesson study, and the teachers there seem to be really liking it as well, and we'll find out in a couple of weeks' time if we've got a big grant from DFAT to work in Papua New Guinea. So the international reach is really growing as well, and that's actually very hard in education because each system tends to have its own approach, but this quality teaching model seems to be quite universal. Glyn Davis, some of you would know, was Vice-Chancellor at Melbourne University and has most recently been Secretary to the Office of Prime Minister and Cabinet. And he wrote a little book called On Life's Lottery and reminds us that birth's a throw of the dice, the consequences of which can last a lifetime. He says, if you believe people deserve an equal chance to prosper, this game of chance is deeply disturbing if nothing follows to even up the inherent unfairness. And I think it's a nice reminder. But what we've found in our most recent research with beginning teachers is how many times the word lucky comes up. I feel lucky that I've got a good colleague, or I'm in a school where people are looking after me. It's just really a frequent point that is made here. And I guess what we're trying to say is it shouldn't be luck if you have a good teacher, or luck if you have a good induction experience. It should be provided for all teachers and therefore, you know, ultimately for all students. Some of the structural constraints, and again, screen's a bit small, but this shows from the Australian teacher workforce data in 2025 what it is that teachers are most troubled by. Workload at the top, 79%, followed by work-life balance, stress, mental health, well-being, administrative workload, and pay is 5th on the list. But the conditions, again, that teachers are working in are really quite challenging. And right now, teachers in New South Wales, for example, are only allowed to do 1 hour of meeting time per week. How you do serious professional development with only 1 hour of meeting time, you know, there are constraints for us in doing this program in that environment, but also when teachers are feeling so overburdened by the workload and so on. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. Very quickly, Sharon Parker's fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences of Australia, and when I also received that title, she was presenting on her work, and she's developed this with colleagues over many, many years, this model of work design applicable to all industries that says work should be stimulating, you should feel a sense of mastery, a sense of agency, it should be relational, and the demands need to be tolerable. And we have one PhD student right now who's applying this to our work on quality teaching rounds and demonstrating how quality teaching rounds helps with the stimulation, mastery, agency, etc. So that's just of interest. We also did analysis using the quality teaching model that's on the vertical axis in relation to years of experience on the horizontal axis. Every dot there is the average on our 18 elements on the 1 to 5 scale for the quality of teaching. And what you see in that kind of vague, fuzzy pattern there is no pattern, effectively. There are no statistically significant differences between first-year out teachers and teachers with 24 or more years of experience. How can that be? And we say there are two main explanations. Either we at university are doing a great job of preparing graduates ready to hit the ground running. We're not doing badly, nowhere near as badly as it's made out to be in the media. The other explanation is most teachers don't get professional development that fundamentally impacts on how they teach. And I think that's actually a more powerful explanation, but we could talk more about that as well. Very briefly, I think what we can do is we've got to support teachers and schools to trial this kind of approach and to keep implementing it. And you know, we're doing all we can there. We need to support teachers to communicate internally with their own people to sort of say how powerful the experience is. And we also need to engage in external communication. One of my colleagues and I are off to Parliament House next week, for example, meeting with a couple of the new ministers who have backgrounds as teachers, meeting with the shadow education minister and various others. So that kind of external communication, doing work in the media, publishing in The Conversation and some of these more popular publication sites, and not just producing academic papers, of course, is another really important role. So I'm just going to finish with this little quote from Margaret Mead, who said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." I'm not saying we've changed the world, but we are making some dents in a way that I think is quite elegant. It's relatively simple for teachers to implement, for schools to implement, but it's not actually easy. But we are making a difference for many teachers and many students, and the work is ongoing. The science is not settled, but we're continuing in our commitment to trying to do the best that we can by teachers and students. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny, for a really interesting and inspiring and engaging lecture. So are there any questions, please?
I meant to stand back here for the
Thank
camera.
you. I was interested in the slide that shows the data for teaching support and the differentiation you demonstrated between the early career teacher and the experienced teacher.
Yeah.
And it was apparent that the rise that had occurred, or the changes that occurred for the early, approached the starting point for the experienced.
Yep.
I'm wondering, are you following those early career and the subset of those who might go on to use the system in the future to see whether they're going to reach that higher level again?
Yeah, to the extent that we have funding for this project, which will continue for another 2 years, we will be following those early career teachers. So, yeah, I mean, that's one of the biggest challenges with educational research, is getting this kind of ongoing funding. And we were so fortunate to win that big grant from the Paul Ramsay Foundation and enable us to do the longitudinal research. But yeah, this project at least will take us up to 4 years into people's careers.
And based on the data you have, do you hypothesise that it will in fact further value add above that, or do you think there's a ceiling effect?
No, I think it will continue to value add for them. Thank you.
Jenny, thank you very much. I have sort of two questions or two things I'd like you to comment on, please. The first is the workforce issue. We continually, I'm not a teacher, and you and I are of similar vintage, I guess. You're probably 15 years younger, but, you know. When I talk to young teachers, I'm regularly struck by the fact that they complain that they can't get permanent positions. So on the one hand, we supposedly have a shortage of teachers. On the other hand, the young teachers can't get permanent positions. That does appear to be in conflict. The second thing is that, you know, being in primary school in the late 60s and early 70s, you know, we had class sizes that were twice what they are now. We regularly have teachers' assistants available now. Gone is the blackboard and the injection of a significant amount of technology. The physical facilities at most schools are infinitely better than they were. So we really seem to be investing about 3 times the resources and producing no better outcome. A 2/3 reduction in productivity, and I hate to use that word this week. What have we done? I mean, have we lost skills that were available? Oh, and our teachers, of course, are much better trained and educated than they ever were. So what have we done? We've put in more resources with no improved outcome. So it would suggest that we've actually done a whole series of negative things, because any advancements we have been equalised by backward steps we've made.
Really important questions, and it's a kind of a much longer answer than I'm going to try and give right now. Just on the teachers not being able to get permanent positions, I mean, it does seem quite incongruous, because with the shortage there have to be more roles, but I think it's partly to do with some nervousness about putting people straight into permanent roles, so they're starting in casual and contract roles. But you would have to say that there have to be more positions available in teaching over the next few years than there has been recently. On the other hand, though, we know that a number of teacher ed students say they want to go straight into casual teaching because they're so dismayed at the state of schools and teaching, and colleagues who are feeling overburdened and overworked and all of that stuff. So they say, I'll just do casual teaching, then I don't have all of the hassle of dealing with you know, meetings and everything else that goes on in school. So that's also a worry, because I think the vocational aspect of teaching, where you're going in because you're passionate about making a difference, seems to have collapsed a bit, and some teachers are going into jobs just to get enough money to pay the mortgage or all of that sort of stuff. So I think that's one of the challenges we face. In terms of why we're not seeing results, I think it's partly because we're tinkering around the edges, and we know that ultimately it's what teachers do in the classroom with students that makes the most difference. You can reform the curriculum over and over, as we have done as a nation, and we're still tinkering with it. But it's not what's written down. It's how teachers interact with their classes that makes the biggest difference. We also have political cycles that have a huge impact on what happens in education. So you have a new government or a new minister come in and they want to make their mark, and so they try something new rather than building on what we already know. And I think another issue is the evidence base. And I think in education we have, and I've written about this as well, we have a lot of graduates who don't understand good research. And so people's understanding of evidence is actually quite poor. And so if someone in an authoritative position and way says, this is how it is, this is what we know, if you don't know enough to challenge them, then you don't challenge them. So I think there's a whole kind of confluence of challenges that mean that we keep replicating things that we've done before in different guises. They've not made a difference before, but we keep trying, and so, you know, the more things change, the more they stay the same. This is a kind of a ball change. We had Deloitte do a cost-benefit analysis of this initiative. They reported a return on investment of a minimum, conservatively, 40 to 1. Every dollar invested in quality teaching rounds returns at least $40 to $150 to the economy, to gross state product uplift. Higher education returns $3 to $4 for every dollar invested. You know, we have all this evidence, but it's really hard when you have state systems of education, you have the multiple sectors within each state, you have changing governments, you have all of these other competing voices out there. What we're finding right now, though, is that teachers and principals are, you know, the groundswell is happening from below. So even when we can't get system level buy-in, and we're getting some of it, but even when we can't get that, we're getting the buy-in from the people who are doing the work in schools. One of my colleagues just interviewed a principal at a school today. He said, we're doing away with the way the department has told us we have to do things in this school. We're scratching that. It's not making a scrap of difference. We're going to invest more fully in quality teaching rounds. But that takes courage and it takes energy. And we know a lot of principals are feeling incredibly burnt out as well. So it's worrying, but we have hope and we keep trying. We chip away. 3 more questions. Thank you.
That was brilliant, Jenny. Can I just ask this, in terms of your quality teaching rounds, I guess the work of being an educationalist is such that you're not divorced from what's happening in the world around us. And so in that sense, does quality teaching rounds utilise, or how is things like AI and the digital world that we live in and mobile phone stuff, etc. Do you sort of grapple with that in terms of whether that's an opportunity or a threat?
Yeah, I mean, we've had one school that did quality teaching rounds focused on technology and how every teacher was using technology to support their learning. So that was a real focus. I mean, that was probably 10 years ago now, the school I'm thinking of. But it's part of every round, because when teachers have those discussions, it's about what was done and how the students responded and what we might have done differently for a better outcome. And so if they're using AI or not, you know, it can be part of those discussions. And what we find is, certainly in Australia, teachers who all have degrees and are actually intelligent people have enough knowledge themselves, especially in a group of 4, to nut out some of those problems. They don't need some external person coming in and telling them this is how you need to do things. So we find it's quite empowering of teachers as well.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I think maybe you've answered the question. In a quality teaching round, does the group develop a strategy or a conversation about the particularly peculiar environment that they're teaching in? I'm just thinking of a school that my daughter teaches at, where the predominant population is in fact Mongolian, and I sort of wonder how that fits, say, with Indigenous teaching plans, or do they develop their own strategy, and where do they get that conversation from?
Yeah, really important question. So the element or the dimension we call significance is all about how you make learning relevant for the kids in your class or in your school. And so it is about teachers using things like background knowledge, cultural knowledge, connectedness, narrative, and thinking through those are 4 elements of the 18 elements in the model, and thinking about, well, how do I tap into the background knowledge? How do I tap into what these kids already know, whether they're Indigenous, Mongolian, etc.? How do I connect with their cultural knowledge? What do I need to learn so that I understand better? How can I use their stories to enrich or stories that will connect. How do I find stories that will enrich the learning for them? How do I make this connected to their lives outside of school? So those elements, for example, all require the teachers to think about the specific context in which they're working. And so what we find sometimes is quality teaching rounds can help teachers identify that they have a need, and they might bring in external people. They might bring in some elders from a particular community, for example, to help them understand better. But mostly we find teachers find this process just so empowering, and it just gives them a chance to sit and talk with one another. That, again, should not be a luxury for any professional, but in teaching, they rarely have a chance to talk at length about their practice. Mostly when teachers get to talk at length, it's about the child who's done something horrendous in the school. It's about, yard duty requirements. It's about, reports to parents. They rarely get to talk about their practice. And that's why I think it's so powerful that just having these 4 days together enables them to do that. Does that answer your question? Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jenny. That was provided lots of food for thought. That's fantastic. I guess I do have a question, but first of all, I have a bit of a comment on the basis of what you were saying before regarding these younger teachers, wanting to take on casual positions because, there wasn't that passion. As a university lecturer, sort of mid-career, I guess, I can see a lot of parallels between us as well. And I wonder if the thing that's driving a loss of passion or a lack of passion is this huge rise in administrative burden that's happening. And the thing is that, I can certainly speak for myself and my colleagues when I say that we have so much admin to do that the emotional bandwidth for passion is kind of sapped. It actually takes you, it's not something we're trained to do, and yet it takes up so much of our time. And so I do wonder if that is something that, I'm sure it's increased a lot in recent years, what with compliance requirements and things like that. That's what we always hear, we have to do this for compliance. And that's just a comment, and I'm not sure about the way around that. But I think that if that is taking up everyone's, proverbial bandwidth, then there really isn't too much space or time left for professional development and to engage in these meaningful conversations. It's just, I don't know.
I think absolutely, and it's the administrative burden, but I think it's also the intensity of it, because it's just relentless, and that partly comes about with the technology as well. And now everyone's been encouraged to use AI to make things more efficient, but then the expectation is more productivity, and it's kind of frightening, I think, that how do we slow everything down again? And I think that's one of the joys of quality teaching rounds for teachers, is it slows things down and just gives them a chance to focus on their core business. So, I hear what you're saying. Yeah.
And then my question was, how do you think, because we were chatting before your lecture, and you mentioned that this QTR approach model was going to be applied in higher education. How do you see that playing out in the sort of conventional lecture theatre? Do you think that it would become less, us standing up the front and just regurgitating information at the students?
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things people often think you have to do innovative forms of teaching to do well on quality teaching on the model. You don't. A lecture can deliver really high quality, but it has to be engaging, it has to be challenging, it has to be interesting and connected. So I don't know that it will necessarily do away with lectures, but I think what we're finding, and we've published a couple of papers already on the higher education work, is we've had people from law, medicine, social work, engineering who've participated, and I think 12 different disciplines who've participated in this approach, and they all find it really valuable. Just to think about their teaching in a slightly different way, in a way that actually makes it easier, because you so often just think of, okay, I'm onto this topic, how do I teach this topic? And it's all the stuff. But if you're thinking about, well, if these students don't hear anything else in this hour lecture, what are the 3 things I want them to walk out of the room with? That kind of concept of deep knowledge, checking for understanding, engaging them, having high expectations of them, giving them explicit quality criteria. These are some of the elements again in the model. Those simple ways of thinking about teaching can really, I think, help lecturers to feel more efficacious about their own practice, but also more satisfied. That's the other thing we're finding, is that it gives people greater satisfaction about their teaching. And then, of course, students like it better. I've got 2 daughters, one who's just in university at the moment, and she is complaining terribly about the quality of teaching in one of her classes, and it's really interesting. I sort of say, why don't you just drop a copy of our quality teaching guide on your lecturer's desk? But of course she won't and wouldn't. But yeah, the experience university students have now is so different as well. They're barely on campus. Many of their courses are taught online. They don't get to know each other. They don't have the romances that many of us had during our university days. And you worry about the future and they have, sometimes these really isolated teaching learning experiences where they watch lectures online at 1.5 or double speed. How can you take it all in? It's so different. And for a lot of us who are older in the room, it's very worrying. But I think, there's still good stuff going on, and there's some fantastic teachers at universities and in schools, and we hang on to the positive.
I think it was interesting what you said before about I doubt I need it. That university now is better. My first thought is it? Is it? I don't know. I like Jenny said, I think about my own university experience, and I was there every day. And I work at the School of Ed at University of Newcastle. I can barely get my students to come to class, and my classes are compulsory. So, I don't know. So.
Yeah, I mean, we have more resources and facilities in some ways, but, we know what's happening at the university at the moment, and, the morale is low, jobs are being lost, and people are worried about what they'll have to pick up as their colleagues are not re-employed and so on. So I think it's a very challenging time. But, there's huge progress at the same time. We know more, we have access to more. How do we bring all that together in a way that works? And obviously this is a very partial solution, but it actually is helping some people, and I guess that's something, we're proud of.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Jenny. That was a wonderful lecture, and we also had some very stimulating questions. So thank you all, and please, if you can, join us for dinner now at the bistro. So thank you again, Jenny.